Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Week 9 Highlight Haven NFL Recap Show. I am your host, Matthew Heiserman, and today we are joined by Josh Wolver of Josh's Sports Report to break down each and every game that took place during Week 9 of the NFL season. Josh, it's great to have you on.
Yeah, Matt, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it and ready to get going.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like our tailgate show, as always, we will be taking callers throughout the stream. So feel free to call in using the link in the chat that I am about to put there. With that being said, we have a lot of games to break down. So let's jump right into it. Starting with Saints versus Panthers in Carolina. Some would say a pretty surprising outcome. Panthers ended up winning this one 23-22 in an NFC South divisional matchup. Major injury in this one. Chris Olave went down with a concussion. Josh, I believe you had the Panthers winning in our tailgate show, so I'll let you start here. What did you see in this game?
Yeah, I did have the Panthers winning. And, I just had one of those gut feelings because these NFC South games are very weird. And a big note about this is actually after this game, Saints head coach Dennis Allen was fired. That's 7 straight losses for New Orleans. So big news on their front. I'm not sure who the interim head coach is, but I can get that if we need. As for this game specifically, you mentioned that the Chris Olave injury was huge for New Orleans, and that was really unfortunate. Derek Carr's first game back, it was pretty good. Didn't turn the ball over, 236 yards and a touchdown. Alvin Kamara also played pretty well, but Chuba Hubbard was great for the Panthers. 2 touchdowns and 72 yards. Xavier Legette found the end zone, and Sanders also had a good game. Carolina improved to 2-7. These probably are two of the worst teams in the NFC. Bryce Young was quarterbacking for Carolina for the second straight week because of the injury to Andy Dalton when he got in that car crash. Bryce Young, he was all right. 16 completions of 26 attempts, 171 yards, a touchdown, but he also did have an interception. Nothing too special from this game. Panthers get the 1-point win.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at it, the Panthers didn't have a great game. I mean, the Saints, despite losing, had more rushing yards, passing yards, yards per play, first downs, total plays in through for fewer interceptions. So, I mean, it wasn't a pretty win by any means for Carolina, but I mean, they were able to get the job done. Still, as you mentioned, Chuba Hubbard had a massive game, 2 touchdowns. And I feel like when you get that run game going against a team that really can't stop the run or isn't especially good at stopping the run, I should say, then that's definitely going to hurt them in the long run. That's what we saw in this game from Carolina. They really did attack that run game, and it worked out very well for them to the point where they didn't have to necessarily get Bryce Young and the receivers as involved, even though, as you mentioned, Jatavion Sanders still, had a little bit of work here and there, but nothing too crazy, at least from Bryce Young. Moving over to the next game, my Washington Commanders against the New York Giants. Commanders 27-22 victory. They are 7-2 for the first time since 1996. Isn't it a great time to be a Commanders fan right now? And I mean, overall, just a really solid game for the Commanders. This completes the sweep, obviously, for in the season against New York. Now, Washington is 2-0 against them. Jaden Daniels, solid game overall. 20 for 26, 228 total yards, 3 total touchdowns, I should say, and 0 interceptions. Uh, or Sorry, Daniel Jones were those stats. 20 of 26, 228 total yards, 3 total touchdowns, and he had a fumble. So yeah, Daniel Jones is what I meant to say. He had a solid game. Jaden Daniels still had a solid game as well, though. 15 of 22, 209 passing yards, and 2 touchdowns. Overall, I think the Commanders, and I mentioned this during the tailgate show, get off to an early lead and contain that lead. Make sure you don't give it up. Don't let your guard down. This is a trap game, and they did not let their guard down. They continued to play. It got close towards the end of the game, but overall, they still did very well. Terry McLaurin, obviously, he had those 2 touchdowns. He actually only had 2 receptions in the entire game, so both of
Mhm.
those receptions went for touchdowns. And I mean, this is pretty funny. The Commanders entered the season with an over/under of 6.5 wins, and they already have 7 wins with 8 games left to go. 4-0 at home. I'll let you give your thoughts here.
Yeah, well, that stat just shows how brilliant Jaden Daniels has played. I think Matt, you hit on most of my main points. And what I saw from this game was this was one of Daniel Jones' better games of the season and of the past 2 seasons. He had 2 throwing touchdowns and a rushing touchdown. That first one was his first touchdown in MetLife Stadium in over 680 days, which I found to be a ridiculous stat. So he finally breaks that curse. By no means was it one of the best games ever. 174 yards, certainly passable, no touchdowns. You mentioned the fumble. If he doesn't have that, I think that highly improves his score. And then when you look at this and you see 5 point game, you say, oh, the Giants kept it close. You have to remember that the Commanders took multiple knees at the 1 yard line to end out the game. So realistically, if they wanted to, assuming they punch that in, this is a 2-score and double-digit point win for Washington. So take the final score as close as it is with a grain of salt, because Washington probably could have scored more if they wanted to. Jaden Daniels mentioned the 2 touchdown passes to Terry McLaurin, and I liked how Washington operated without Brian Robinson Jr. Austin Eckler did a nice job stepping up. He split carries with Chris Rodriguez, who also played really well, but Eckler did have the 1 rushing touchdown for Washington. The big thing for the Giants all year has been the defensive line, and they only get home twice in the entire game, which I thought was big for Washington. I think this was a game that Washington was meant to win. They got the job done. And if you remember last time these 2 teams played early in the week 2 or week 3, I mean, this was all field goals, right? So this shows you how Washington's offense has been able to develop. Good win for Washington. Matt, you've got to be really happy. 7-2 football team. Daniels is looking great.
Yeah, and I mean, the Commanders' next game is at home against the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think that'll be a good test. I wouldn't necessarily say
Mhm.
the Steelers are really as talented as their record shows. They're obviously a 6-2 team. I definitely think that's a winnable game for the Commanders, though. So I'm excited to see what happens in that one. Moving on, we have the Dolphins at Buffalo Bills. The Bills won on a game-winning field goal, 30-27. Tyler Bass, 61 yards, which is the Buffalo franchise record for longest field goal of all time. I'll let you start here.
Yeah, well, Buffalo just barely escapes, but 30-27, pretty high scoring affair, 57 total points. If you look back to that first half, the halftime score was actually 10-6 in favor of Miami. Both teams exploded in the second half. Miami Buffalo 3 second half touchdowns, Miami 2, and it was decided by a late game field goal. I think Tua Tagovailoa, a really good game. He did not excuse me, he completed 25 of 28 passes, so that's only 3 incompletions on the day, 2 touchdowns pairs along with it. I said that their playmakers had to make plays heading into this game, and they did just that. Tyreek Hill, 4 receptions, 80 yards. Devon Achane, uh, 8 receptions in the receiving game, 58 yards and a touchdown. And then in the ground game, he also had 63 yards and a touchdown. So well over 125 yards in total scrimmage yards and 2 touchdowns for him, which was big. For Buffalo, Josh Allen continues to prove why he has a strong case for MVP. This is a 3 touchdown, 235-yard performance, though he did have the 1 turnover. But I honestly think that wasn't really his fault. He put the
Yeah, I
ball
was I was gonna say, if you
right on
saw the turnover, it definitely wasn't his fault there.
right. He put the ball right onto the body of his receiver, maybe Khalil Shakir, but
It
Jalen
was,
Ramsey
Keon Coleman, I believe.
Keon Coleman, yeah, you're right. Jalen Ramsey just made a heck of a play on that ball. So no blame on Allen, but I think he did have a great game overall. The running game wasn't it as much for Buffalo, but they had multiple explosive plays. You saw Khalil Shakir with a couple. Ray Davis with that huge 50-something yard reception where he made a whole lot of defenders miss. Buffalo barely ekes out with the win in Orchard Park to improve to 7-2, and they continue to run away with the division.
And I feel like you kinda covered most of the stuff there. Overall, a lot of progress that we saw from Miami's offense, at least in this game, of course, compared to how
Mhm.
they looked without Tua, and we knew that they were going to get better, but as you mentioned, Chain. He plays a lot better with Tua. That was shown this game, 121 scrimmage yards, 2 total touchdowns. Tyreek, 80 receiving yards, which is his second most receiving yards total of the season, which is kind of crazy to believe in week 9 for Tyreek Hill. Definitely a struggling season for him. But
Mhm.
the uh, the Dolphins are 2-6 right now. Is the comeback to make the playoffs possible? I feel like the division title is kind of out of the picture, but I mean they play in a division with the Jets who are struggling. They play against a struggling New England Patriots. Is the playoffs still possible for them?
Honestly, Matt, we go by each week. I'm starting to think not as much, right? They're in a great AFC conference that's going to be really tough to play in a bye week. And Matt, when you want to contend for a playoff spot, especially out of the hole that you've dug yourself into, these are the games that you need to be winning. These close games. This game almost went into overtime against a great team, against a great division rival to try and leapfrog yourself up in the standings. If Miami isn't winning these games like these, I really don't see a way that they can, it was an unfortunate break that they caught when Tua went down with yet another injury, but it's going to be really hard for them to battle back. I don't see a way that they come back from this.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree with you there. Moving over to the next game, Chargers versus Browns in Cleveland. Chargers pretty dominant win, 27-10. And keep in mind, Cleveland did get a touchdown on the last play of the game, so
Mhm.
more realistically, 27-3, based on how the game actually took place. Jameis Winston, 26 of 46, not a great completion percentage, 235 passing yards, a touchdown and a costly 3 interceptions. I told you him throwing perfect isn't going to last forever.
Mhm.
We know how good Jameis Winston's arm is, but when it comes to accuracy and decision making, that's when it becomes a little shaky. And he definitely showed some of that poor decision making in this game. Cedric Tillman, another big game, 6 receptions, 75 yards, and a touchdown. Nick Chubb has had a very slow start back. In 2 games, he's had a total of 27 carries for just 74 yards, which is 2.7 yards per attempt. Definitely not great there. Justin Herbert looked good, 18 of 27, 282 yards and 2 touchdowns. J.K. Dobbins, 2 touchdown game as well, 85 yards rushing. And then Quentin Johnston had a touchdown on 118 receiving yards. Overall, Chargers, we know how good their defense has been this year. They've only allowed 20 points in 1 game throughout the entire season,
Wow.
and that was week 3 against, the Pittsburgh Steelers when they allowed 20 points on the dot. But overall, I believe they allow an average of about 13 points per game, which is really, really impressive
Mhm.
there. What were your main takeaways from this matchup?
Yeah, we saw the ability of Justin Herbert to command the offense, 282 yards and 2 touchdowns. J.K. Dobbins been an absolute dog since coming over to Los Angeles. Another 2 touchdowns to his name. He has been leading the running group for them. And then I said this in the pregame show. I'm expecting big games from Quentin Johnson and Lad McConkey, and they total for almost 200 yards and a touchdown. So that was a great game from both of them. They by far led the Chargers offense. And then when you look at things from the side of the Browns, I thought this was a game that they could keep a little closer, but they did not prove that to be. Jameis Winston, you mentioned it, 3 interceptions is not winning football play, and and 2 of those were just terrible decisions. And then, Matt, if I recall watching this on Red Zone, I think two, um, or maybe it was just one, but at least one, I think probably two of the Chargers touchdowns, they just heaved it up into blown coverage, right? There seemed to be a lot of miscommunication on the
Mhm.
back end of that Browns secondary. I know they had a 66-yard touchdown. It was just no one was in the zip code. I mean, there was just some terrible defensive play from Cleveland that really was really costly in this game, I guess you could say. Cleveland just wasn't great at all offensively. They never got anything going. You mentioned the lingering, what feels like the lingering setback to Nick Chubb since coming back has been very apparent. I do like the way that Jerry Judy got involved in this game for Cleveland, but nothing went right for them. You mentioned it; they get that touchdown last play of the game, basically a bit of stat padding. But if we take it for what it was when the game really was over at the time, this is a dominating Chargers win, and they show me that they could be for real as we head into the midway point of the season.
Yeah, and I mean, we already saw it with the Browns earlier this season. They obviously traded Amari Cooper to the Buffalo Bills. We could definitely be seeing a lot more trades. The trade deadline in the NFL is tomorrow. So we will see a lot of exciting moves. The Browns being a team that could definitely make a lot of those moves. I think two really big potential players that could be traded are Zadarius Smith and then also Greg Newsome. And then I
Mhm.
think two players that there's a shot that they get traded, but not very likely, would be Denzel Ward, and then a very, very slight chance that Myles Garrett potentially gets dealed. I
Right.
doubt that, but it could potentially happen. So that'll definitely shake up the organization a little bit. Not that they're going to be contending for anything this year, either way, but I know my Washington Commanders might be looking at a few of those guys. So we'll see if they, pull the trigger on any of those moves. Moving over to the next game, pretty boring one. Had an exciting ending, but still not a very interesting game throughout. Patriots versus Titans. Titans ended up winning on another game-winning field goal, second of the week so far. 20-17 final score. Nick Folk was the one who got that game-winning field goal. I'll let you start it off here.
Yeah, I feel like you summed this one up pretty well. This was a game I was not at all interested in going into the week, but you always like an OT finish, can't complain when you see that. Drake May went into the bag of tricks on the last play of the game with time expiring. I felt I mean, he had all day in the pocket. He took about 20 seconds to get rid of the ball, chucked up prayer, and somehow it fell into the hands of Ramondre Stevenson in the end zone who dove on it. I mean, it was just a crazy ending to even force overtime for New England. But these were two really bad teams coming into the day. If you take away that Drake May prayer at the end of the game, it's a no touchdown, two interception day for him, which isn't great. Ramondre Stevenson, absolutely horrendous for New England. 10 carries for 16 yards. He did have a touchdown, but that was from the 1 yard line. When you look at the other side of things, May was just completely outplayed by Mason Rudolph. 240 yards on 20 completions, two touchdowns, and an interception. I said the key for Tennessee was going to be Tony Pollard, and he showed up. 28 carries, 128 yards. He was an absolute workhorse. Calvin Ridley led them in the receiving department. And then when you look at the team stats for New England, it is 3 of 11 on third down, which really isn't going to cut it enough. And then both teams took a lot of penalties. Tennessee took 10, New England took 8. But Tennessee outgained New England by more than 100 yards. They probably deserved this win a lot more than New England did. They did force overtime, but eventually Tennessee did win 20-7. They improved to 2-6. New England falls to 2-7. These are two contenders for the number one pick, Matt.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that despite the loss, I think that Patriots fans can at least be excited with what they saw from Drake May. I know, obviously, you mentioned he had, I believe, two interceptions and wouldn't have gotten a touchdown if it weren't for that last play. However, he was using his feet a lot this game, 95 rushing yards as well. And then, I mean, I think he just showed, you know, a lot of potential, especially on that final drive. They had to drive down quickly, and he did that. He did it very well. He looked comfortable out there, and he did lead the game tying drive. So that's at least good for the Patriots. And I know these teams are both not good, but I'd still be much happier from a Patriots standpoint with the fact that they have this young guy in Drake May that they do have, because I think he could bring a lot of potential in the future. Nick Westbrook Akine has 3 receiving touchdowns in his last 3 games, one each game. Something to keep an eye out maybe for fantasy owners. But overall, not that much of an exciting game. Moving over to a game that I thought was a lot more interesting, Cowboys versus Falcons. Falcons ended up winning this one 27-21. I feel like this week has not had many injuries. However, there were a few major ones in this game. Drake London left with a hip injury, and then Dak Prescott left with a hamstring injury. Prescott, before leaving, was 18 of 24, 133 yards and a touchdown. And per Adam Schefter, Prescott will miss several weeks, and the Cowboys are deciding whether they want to put him on IR or not. So that could definitely be a big move there, depending on what happens. Cooper Rush, when he took over, 13 of 25, 115 yards and a touchdown. Rico Dowdle, also pretty effective, 107 scrimmage yards and a touchdown. But Kirk Cousins has been on a roll. We were talking during the tailgate show. He's been very inconsistent. We don't know whether we can expect that Kirk Cousins, who throws, 4 touchdowns and 0 to 1 interception, or if we can expect that Kirk Cousins that maybe throws 150 yards, a touchdown, and 3 interceptions. This game, we saw that first Kirk Cousins that I mentioned. He was 19 of 24, 222 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. That's Cousins' second straight game passing for 3 or more touchdowns and 0 interceptions. Bijan Robinson, 145 scrimmage yards, very active both in the rushing and receiving game. Drake London has 6 receiving touchdowns on the year. Darnell Mooney, 5 receptions, 88 yards and a touchdown. We saw him have that one wide open play on just some botched coverage there from the Dallas defense. Atlanta has not had a winning season since 2017. Things are looking like that is going to change this year. What were your main takeaways from that one?
Yeah, I mean, my main takeaway from that one is that the Cowboys might be screwed. We came into this week at on the tailgate show talking about how this was a must-win game. Not only do they lose, but their 60, $70 million quarterback is out for multiple weeks, Matt. That is going to mess them up. And then we also talked about, I think, on the tailgate show, what a rough schedule they have coming up. And certainly Cooper Rush is not going to help that fact out. As for this game, specifically, I mean, an amazing catch by Rico Dowdle, juggling it, tossing it up. He somehow hauled it in, and that was probably the highlight of the day for the Cowboys. One questionable decision was that Brian Anger fake punt where he threw it, and it was just nowhere close. Jake Ferguson, a big game for Dallas, but that was a bad hit in the receiving game. And then you mentioned Kirk Cousins, the key for him is going to be the consistency down the stretch. And if he continues to play like this into next year, could you see? Well, not could you see. My question is where and when do you see Michael Penix taking over that starting role for Atlanta? Because if Kirk Cousins is going to be playing like this, the answer is not anytime soon. Remember, Atlanta shocked the NFL world taking Michael Penix Jr. out of Washington early in that first round after signing Cousins 4 years, $100 million plus. Bijan Robinson, another great game, showing why he has been very important to them all year. Darnell Mooney, a huge game for him as well. 88 receiving yards and a touchdown. And when you take a look at the team stats, Cowboys commit 9 penalties, go 3 of 13 on third downs and 1 of 5 on fourth downs. Isn't going to cut it, though. They do only lose by a 6 points, which is a bit more promising of a sign, but they still dropped to 3-5 with quarterback issues. Where do they go from here? They've got some problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Cowboys season is completely over. Not only do they have that extremely tough schedule, but now they have to ride it out at least for a few weeks with a backup quarterback. And I mean, they would just need nothing short of a miracle to turn this around. They obviously still are playing in that tough division where it feels like the Commanders or Eagles are basically a lock at this point to win the division, at least one of those two. Moving over to the next game, though, I have a lot of early window games this week. This one, Raiders versus Bengals in Cincinnati. Raiders 24, Bengals 41. No major injuries in this one. I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, 24-41, but you have to remember 2 of those Las Vegas touchdowns came in the fourth quarter of garbage time. So this is a blowout win for Cincinnati. Joe Burrow, a 5-touchdown game. This is what they paid the man the big bucks for. 251 yards on 27 completions. Chase Brown led the running game with 120 yards. Mike Gesicki, the tight end, he had his awful looking gritty that I refuse to look at, but he got to do it twice because he found the end zone twice. 100 yards receiving on the day for him. And then the Raiders, another bad game for Gardner Minshew, and then Desmond Ridder also came in to relieve him after he got benched. Ridder threw the only touchdown of the game for Las Vegas. only 74 yards through the air for them. Nothing was going right for them except for Jacoby Myers, 8 receptions, 105 yards. Then after this game, Las Vegas fired their offensive coordinator, which is another storyline to look out for. So Vegas fires their OC and New Orleans fires their head coach. Those are two big things. And in addition to the Raiders' struggles, they lost 2 fumbles in this game. They allowed 5 sacks offensively. They only got 16 first downs. The Bengals got 10 more, 26. Way outgained them by almost 300, by almost 150 yards. Bengals were approaching 400 total yards. This game was domination. Bengals went 41-24.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Burrow, as you mentioned, 5 touchdowns. Just an insane game. Completed 27 passes. And what really caught my attention, 27 passes, 5 touchdowns. 19% of Joe Burrow's completions were touchdowns, which is
Wow.
absolutely insane.
Yeah.
He threw a touchdown 1 in every 5 plays, I guess. Desmond Ridder played solid when he came in. Jacoby Myers had a good game. Brock Bowers, another big game for him as well. 64 receiving yards per game this season, 2 total touchdowns. But yeah, we've seen Mike Gesicki get active, especially recently. And Trey Hendrickson, 4 sacks on the defensive end, but not really close at all to start with. And then moving over to another game in which the winning team scored 41 points. Ravens versus Broncos at home in Baltimore. Ravens 41-10 victory. Bo Nix 19 of 33, 223 yards, 1 receiving touchdown, and then 1 interception. Not a bad game from him necessarily, but it doesn't really compare to how solid or good he's been playing in some past weeks, especially recently for Denver. Cortland Sutton, big game, 7 receptions, 122 receiving yards, and then he was the one who threw the touchdown to Bo Nix. Lamar Jackson, lock for MVP if he keeps this up. 16 of 19, 280 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. He's insane. We know that. Derrick Henry, 133 scrimmage yards, 2 touchdowns. Henry obviously rushed for his 100th career touchdown in this game. Also got his 1,000th rushing yard of the season. So a lot of big news there for Derrick Henry. Zay Flowers, been amazing recently. 5 receptions, 127 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Ravens, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think they have the most unstoppable offense in the NFL. Lions are up there. Lions can produce. We know how well they can score. But I mean, you just put Lamar and Henry together, and they cannot be stopped. They've been so good. Um, I mean, all in all, Baltimore was hot right out of the gate. Denver's defense just couldn't contain them. Right now, Ravens are right behind the Steelers in the AFC North. Don't expect them to be behind them for very much longer, though.
Yeah, you mentioned another blowout in this one. Ravens win by 31 points, but I actually did not mind the way that Denver started this one out, only allowing 7 points in that opening quarter. I know they didn't get on the board, but that's what you need from this Denver defense to complement the offense. When Bo Nix has a slow start, that defense needs to step up, and I feel like they did in the first quarter. Too bad it's a 4-quarter game because Baltimore tacked on, another 30-something points at the end, and then you mentioned it, the Philly special work to perfection. Bo Nix went up there and boxed it out like an NBA center. That was definitely the highlight of the day for Denver. I thought that was a really funny play. Cortland Sutton just tossed it up and Bo Nix went and got it. But we mentioned on the Tailgate Show how unstoppable the backfield of Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry is, especially on that option play. You mentioned how big of a game Derrick Henry had, 106 yards and 2 touchdowns. But something I want to highlight, Matt, is when was the last time you saw Lamar Jackson rush 3 times for 4 yards? Because that was his rushing stat line in this game. We mentioned, the option play, the pitches, how much magic that can create. Really none in this game through the ground for Lamar, but it was made up for in the receiving game. Zay Flowers, a ginormous game, 127 yards on 5 receptions. That's almost 25 and a half yards per reception. 2 touchdown pairs along with that. Justice Hill, another big game. He also had over 60 yards from scrimmage. And the Baltimore defense did their job against Denver offense that was rolling. Kyle Hamilton and Trenton Simpson both had 7 total tackles, so I liked what I see from that Ravens defense. And then back to the offense, 25 first downs. It was 400 yards total, and they dominated, when it comes to just keeping the ball rolling, right? It feels like every single
Mhm.
drive for Baltimore, they were producing something good offensively, and that's why they ended up scoring 41 points. Great game from Baltimore. They continue to roll at 6-3. Could you see them, Matt, running away with this division? I know you talked about the Steelers. You weren't as high on them. Do the Steelers have a chance, or is this Baltimore's division?
The Steelers have a chance, but no, it really is Baltimore's division, in my opinion. And then we also are going to see either one or two more games between the Ravens and the Steelers. I don't know if they've already played. I believe it's two more games.
Yeah, no, I don't think they've played so far.
Yeah, so that's really where the Ravens are going to take the lead in that one.
Mhm.
And moving over to the late window games, Bears versus Cardinals in Arizona. Just a terrible game, to be honest. Really boring. Cardinals won 29-9. The Bears just look rattled. Of course, they had the Hail Mary loss last week, and then they lose by 20 this week. Caleb Williams, 24 or 22 of 41, 217 passing yards. And I said that in the tailgate show that the key for the Cardinals winning this game would be just containing DeAndre Swift, considering how good he had played up to this game. And they were able to do that. Swift had 16 carries for just 51 yards. Roma Dunze looked solid, 5 receptions for 104 yards. And Kyler Murray, not a great game by any means, 13 of 20 for 154 yards. However, they didn't really need to rely on him. Where the Cardinals made most of their impact this game was in the run game. That's where they really thrived. Not only did James Conner have 107 rushing yards, but Arizona also had rushing touchdowns from Amari DiMercado and Trey Benson, as well as Trey McBride, who actually got in there for a 2-yard rushing touchdown. Cardinals ended up having 144 more rushing yards than the Bears, and they now lead the NFC West.
Yeah, Matt, you hit on every point there is in this game. 29-9. There's not much to see. Chicago doesn't find the end zone at all in this game, and that is not the way they're looking for Caleb Williams to play. You're absolutely right. Arizona did what they needed to. They contained the run game. They forced Caleb Williams to pass 41 times, and he only completed about half of those. Big game from Roma Dunze, but that's just about it from the Chicago offense. When you look at it from Arizona's side of things, and I think you touched on this beautifully, Kyler Murray, not the best game, but just enough to get done. They played well enough, especially in the run game where they had 213 yards as opposed to Chicago's 69. That's where they thrived in this game. Arizona's defense got 6 total sacks, and Chicago only converted on 3 third downs out of 14 tries. This was a game that really there's not much to it. Arizona scores more than it felt like during this game, but yeah, there's not really much to say about this. Arizona goes to above 500 at 5-4. Chicago now even exactly at 500. They're 4-4 in one of the toughest divisions in football. And realistically, they had a good roster coming into this, but there's a pretty good chance that they finished last in this division. And that's kind of crazy to say they're at 500.
Yeah, and if you before we move on to the next game, if you're watching this, make sure to call in using the link in the chat. We will also be answering questions. If you have any questions, put them in the chat as well. As Josh is saying, down below in the chat, leave your questions and we will answer them. But moving over to the next game, Jaguars versus Eagles in Philadelphia. Eagles 28-23. Let me tell you, I was rooting for the Jaguars a lot in this game, and it was looking good at the end until Trevor Lawrence threw that game-sealing interception on Jacksonville's final drive. Up until that happened, he was 16 of 31, 169 passing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and then 1 interception. He passed for that second interception on that drive, as I mentioned. Jalen Hurts had a really, really good game. 18 of 24, 297 total yards, including rushing yards, and 3 total touchdowns. Saquon Barkley, 199 scrimmage yards, 2 total touchdowns. He went off. Devontae Smith, 4 receptions, 89 yards, and a touchdown. Philly outrushed Jacksonville by 177 yards. A.J. Brown did go down with a knee injury in this one, but obviously we're not sure quite the extent of that right now. But obviously, Devontae Smith did definitely fill his role very well. Eagles are currently on a 4-game winning streak, and Jacksonville is now 2-7.
Yeah, well, the stats would suggest that this is going to be a lot bigger of a blowout in favor of Philadelphia than it actually was. 237 rush yards to 60. That's 3 Jacksonville turnovers to 1 Philadelphia turnover. And the Eagles really looked like they were going to make this game non-competitive in that first half. They go out into halftime with a 16-point lead. Jacksonville just looks absolutely lost offensively. I mean, they got nothing going for them. Trevor Lawrence on the day finishes 2 interceptions, no touchdowns, 169 yards after getting that huge paycheck in the offseason. That's not going to help his case. But Philadelphia, we talked about this. Nick Sirianni was still on the hot seat despite 2 good games heading into this week. That second half, that's a head scratcher for Philadelphia. That second half is a head scratcher. This is a no-good Jaguars team coming off multiple embarrassing losses in London. I mean, you drop one. You drop a couple of games that were blowouts. Doug Peterson has not been doing a good job. I guess you can say they did a good job scraping their way back into this game. But boy, my main takeaway is Saquon Barkley for Offensive Player of the Year. 159 yards, a touchdown on the ground, a touchdown in the air. I mean, where was this guy? He was all over the field, close to 200 yards when it's all said and done. That's almost half of Philadelphia's total yards. So great game from him. When you look at it from Jacksonville's side, there's not much to be happy about. They had 14 forced downs, 3 of 10 on third down, as opposed to Philadelphia, who went over 50% on third downs. They were 9 of 17. There's not a lot to take away from this game just because, well, if you take away from the Jaguars side, terrible first half. I guess you can say you climbed your way back into this, but at 2-7, you're nowhere where you expected to be heading into the season. Philadelphia, way to hold on, improved to 6-2. Doesn't feel like they're that good of a 6-2 football team. And you mentioned it, they're competing with the Commanders for that division. This is probably a game that they should have won by more, but I guess they'll take a win any way they can get it. 28-23 is your final.
Yeah, and they still have their 2 games against the Commanders. Those will be very telling in terms of deciding who wins that division. And I do remember during the tailgate show, I believe I said that if I did a redraft in fantasy football, Saquon would be my number 1 draft pick. I forgot I would actually go Derrick Henry number 1. I did forget about him in the moment. He's had a touchdown in every single game this season. But besides that, Saquon Barkley would probably be my number 2 option just with how consistent he's been. Moving over to the next game, we have 3 more games to go. Rams versus Seahawks in Seattle. Rams 26-20. This one was a game-winning touchdown in overtime that decided the game. Stafford to Demarcus Robinson for 39 yards. Cameron Kitchens had an interception for the Rams. Returned 103 yards for a touchdown, longest touchdown of the season, I believe. Puka Nacua was ejected for throwing a punch there, not really, acceptable in how close this matchup was. Stafford, 25 of 44, 298 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Cooper Kupp, 11 receptions for 104 yards. Demarcus Robinson, 6 receptions, 94 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Geno Smith had a, solid game. 21 of 34, 363 passing yards. I believe he leads the league in passing yards and yards per game. He had 3 touchdowns as well, but 3 interceptions, not something to really like, at least in that aspect of the game. His passing, he's very effective when passing, but he definitely is slightly turnover prone. I think Seahawks are definitely going to have to work on that. Jackson Smith and Jigba, though, 7 receptions, 180 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The Rams allowed 0 sacks the entire game. Seattle allowed 7 sacks. I think that was a big story to the outcome.
Yeah, well, there's a few things I want to touch on. The first is Geno Smith's pretty rocky day, up and down. You look at 3 touchdowns, you say great, and then the 3 interceptions bring you right back down, probably lower than the 3 touchdowns do. But then the 363 yards put you right back up there. Huge day for Jackson Smith and Jigba. He got me only almost 40 points for my fantasy team, which is great because I was debating sitting him this week. Good thing I didn't. I would have lost my fantasy matchup. So thanks, JSN, for that awesome performance. Matthew Stafford threw 44 times, 298 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Cooper Kupp, the big game. So he's been, vital to them coming back off that injury. And then Matt, you said in the pregame show, in the tailgate show, that it wasn't fair because Matthew Stafford has been throwing to Demarcus Robinson all these weeks. How about 94 yards and 2 touchdowns for that? Ooh, had a little spice to it. Seattle, a big problem. 12 penalties, 95 yards is not going to cut it, but the Rams weren't much better there. Eight penalties, 83 yards. These teams combined to convert 7 third downs out of 27 attempts. So that was not very good. You mentioned that huge pick six for Los Angeles put them over the hump. I knew this was going to be a close game. I did just have the Rams winning barely, but nobody expected Puka Nacua 1 reception, 11 yards, and to be thrown out of the game. So that definitely added a twist down the stretch of that game. Overall, Los Angeles is at 4-4. Seattle's at 4-5. Remember, that division is kind of wonky because people thought the 49ers would run away with it, but boy, have they been injury plagued. CMC hasn't played a snap all season, continues all the way down the line. I mean, Debo, Ayuk, everywhere you look, there's been injuries. Even their running back too, Jordan Mason. He was also hurt after he filled in well. So that division the door is wide open. You saw Arizona pick up a win. The door is wide open in that division. So this was a big NFC West divisional game. Los Angeles does eke it out. 26-20 is your final.
Yeah, now Lions versus Packers in Green Bay. Lions' first outdoors game of the season didn't seem to affect them though. 24-14 victory. Detroit won. I'll let you start it off here. A game that we were definitely considering to be the game of the week, at least going into this week. Did it live up to those expectations?
Yeah, well, I mean, rainy day. It wasn't exactly the game of the week that people were expecting it to, but it was definitely the best game out of that late window slate. And definitely the most exciting one. Detroit improves to 7-1 on the season. Green Bay goes down in the standings. They're at 6-3. And when you look at this game, it was highlighted by that middle section of the game for Detroit. Green Bay started off with a Brandon McManus field goal. Detroit went on to score 24 unanswered points through the second quarter. Then they bridged that through halftime into the third quarter. Jahmyr Gibbs got that touchdown run to start off the second half. And that's where Detroit scored all their points, and they never looked back. The defense was able to steal the deal. In this game, it was kind of interesting what Detroit did with the running situation. We saw Jahmyr Gibbs get a majority of the workload, or at least because Montgomery was a little bit fatigued. But in this game, Montgomery gets 17 carries, Gibbs only 11, though Jahmyr did have the touchdown. Amon-Ra continues his great season, a touchdown in 56 yards, by far leading the receiving room for Detroit, but not a great game from Jared Goff. I mean, 18-22 is pretty good, only 145 yards and the 1 touchdown that we just mentioned. On the other side of things, Jordan Love quarterbacking Green Bay, 273 yards, no touchdowns and interception. Josh Jacobs, we mentioned he was a key heading into this one. And then who would take that big step forward for the Green Bay receiving room in an important game like this? The answer is Jaden Reed, emerging as a wide receiver one. 5 receptions, 113 yards. And then the next best guy after him is Christian Watson with 3 receptions for 37 yards. Interesting about this game, Green Bay way outgained Detroit, even though they ended up losing the game by 10. Matt, I'll turn it over to you. What did you see out of the supposed biggest game of the week?
Well, I think a lot of having more yards than the team that beat you is some garbage time stuff at the end. and the fact that they really have to, pass the ball a lot to try and get back in things. So we probably saw a lot of that in this game. And then Jared Goff, I feel like he's a guy that doesn't need to have the stats to make a big impact. I mean, we saw, I think it was last week, just 85 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns. Lions scored 52 points in that game. So he can really make an impact at quarterback, even if he's not necessarily getting the most passing yards or the most touchdowns. You touched on Gibbs and Montgomery, how good they played. Combined 138 rushing yards and a touchdown. Amon-Ra has a receiving touchdown in 6 straight games, which is pretty crazy, And then Brian Branch was ejected for a dirty hit, I guess you could call it. I felt like that call was kind of BS, but I mean, I guess that's what the call was. Kirby Joseph had an interception return for a touchdown. Looked like the ball maybe just, Jordan Love was getting hit on that play and had to get it out quickly. Probably should have taken the sack, ended up forcing up a really, really bad pass. Overall, just pretty struggling game from Jordan Love. Didn't get into the end zone at all this game. Josh Jacobs solid. You mentioned Jaden Reed was obviously the lead receiver for Green Bay. Lions have won 6 in a row. It's their first time being 7-1 since 1956. Yeah, Detroit is a struggling franchise. I'm honestly kind of surprised that they've ever been 7-1 in their entire franchise, but I guess they used to be good in the 50s. But moving over to the final game, Colts versus Vikings, Sunday night matchup in Minnesota. Vikings 21-13 victory. Joe Flacco, 16 of 27, 179 yards and an interception. Colts had no offensive touchdowns. Kenny Moore did return a fumble to the house. Sam Darnold, 28 of 34, 290 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Justin Jefferson had a Justin Jefferson-like game, 7 receptions for 137 yards. And then Josh Oliver and Jordan Addison combined for 10 receptions, 100 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. I mean, I just want your overall thoughts. Overall, not too crazy of a game, in my opinion, just a good win for Minnesota after losing 2 straight, just to regain that confidence and prove again why they are a team to, watch out for in the NFC.
Yeah, this was certainly not the jolt of electricity that Indianapolis hoped they would get by starting Joe Flacco over the struggling Anthony Richardson. You touched on it a little bit. They had no offensive touchdowns. The only time they found the end zone was a Kenny Moore scoop and score. That rhymes. That actually wasn't planned, but rolls off the tongue pretty well. Jonathan Taylor, pretty disappointing game, honestly. Only 48 yards on 13 carries, and there really wasn't much to love from the Colts offense. They drove into field goal range twice, I guess. Sam Darnold and the Vikings offense, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Justin Jefferson, a huge game. 137 yards on 7 receptions. And then the 3 touchdowns come from Jalen Naylor, Jordan Addison, and Josh Oliver. Great catch by Addison. I do want to shout that one out on it. Running game wasn't really effective for either team. For Minnesota, it was Aaron Jones 21 times for 64 yards. The problem is for Minnesota, the turnover game. You lose the fumble and it costs you 6 points, and then you throw another 2 interceptions on top of that is going to cost you later in the game, later in the season against better teams. The biggest part where I see this game is the first downs and the third down efficiency. First downs, 29 Minnesota, 13 Indianapolis. Third down efficiency, 6 of 12 for Minnesota, 3 of 11 for the Indianapolis Colts. There was no way that Indianapolis was going to march into Minnesota in prime time and pick up the win. Vikings improved to 6-2 again in that great division. Indianapolis, they still have a chance to win that division. Houston lost this week, which is kind of big for them in their hopes to still make the playoffs. But now as an under 500 team, you wonder where they go with the quarterback play that's been very questionable. Overall, I saw the Vikings take care of business on a primetime game. 6-2, they're fighting to stay alive in that NFC North.
Yeah, comment any final questions before we wrap things up. Now, I mean, we talked about the struggling uh, Joe Flacco game. Of course, you don't want to have to sit your former fourth overall pick in Anthony Richardson, but it felt like they had to going into this game just with how much he had struggled and compared to how good Joe Flacco had played. But Joe Flacco, not a great game out there. Do you think they're going to go back to Richardson after this one?
Ooh, that's a really tough call. Honestly, I think you let Joe Flacco ride one more week. I'm not sure who they have next week. Let me take a look at their upcoming schedule. So their next game is going to be against the Bills. So that's going to be a very tough game, no matter who you start at quarterback. Um, you're hosting the Bills next Sunday. I honestly would let Anthony Richardson start. I didn't like the way Joe Flacco played in this game. There's going to be very tough to beat the Bills. Honestly, actually, I'm going to change my mind. Joe
Yeah.
Flacco's veteran experience might be a little bit better against a great
I just
Buffalo defense. It's a tough call. You're going to need a lot to beat a good Buffalo team,
I
though.
I just think that, we could see Richardson throw a lot of costly turnovers if he does play this game. Not that Joe Flacco wouldn't, because Joe Flacco also obviously threw an interception in this game, but he at least has a little more experience and can limit some of those, lower IQ plays, I guess, with how long, of course, he's been in the game. He has that experience, as I mentioned. But yeah, I'd probably go Joe Flacco. Plus, you don't want to switch back and forth like every single week because that's just not good for the quarterbacks. They don't want to have to, start, sit, start, sit.
And that's
Just not,
confusing also for the offensive
yeah,
unit.
mm,
There's just two different play styles.
yeah,
Joe Flacco's
completely.
practically immobile, and
Yeah.
Anthony Richardson's probably best attribute
Mhm.
this season has been running. Not to interrupt you, Matt. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, but I mean, with that being said, we are going to have to wrap things up. I can't thank you enough for coming on. Really do appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to say to the people watching before we wrap things up?
This wasn't the best week of football, but
No.
enjoy it any way you can get. We're approaching the halfway point of the season. It has not felt like 9 weeks or
No.
whatever we are of football so far. So we're gonna have to soak in these last couple weeks. Red zones are gonna come to a halt, and before you know it, we'll be in the playoffs and we'll be predicting who's gonna win the Super Bowl, Matt. So really appreciate you having me on. Let's enjoy these last couple weeks of football, and I'll catch you guys all on the tailgate show coming up this weekend.
Yeah, and I mean, it's crazy. This is our third recap show. It feels like we started the recap show just like a week ago. Been
Yeah.
3 weeks already. Pretty crazy. But for anyone who made it up to this point, can't thank you enough for watching. Again, I'm Matthew Heiserman alongside Josh Wolver for your Week 9 Highlight Haven NFL recap show. And as always, we'll see you next time.